So you ready to move on to the next archetypal energy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got spring, where the prophets are born, and then we've got summer, the nomad generational archetype energy is born. Autumn and fall, the hero generation is born, and now we're actually in winter right now, according to generational theory. So we're in the middle of winter, and we've been here probably for a few years, maybe a decade.
Moving on a couple decades, I think.
Yeah, I think we're coming into our second, at least well into our second decade of a winter. And again, these aren't like at midnight on this date, it like clicks and it's all of a sudden winter. It's just like real seasons. It's hard to tell when autumn ends and when winter begins experientially. Now we know the equinox of the sun, but experientially it kind of just blends into the next one. Mm-hmm. So it's been a slow dial up into winter. We're in the middle of this. Who's being born? What archetypal energy is coming online and being born right now?
So the fourth and final archetypal energy are the artists. And right now they're represented by Gen Z, what's called Gen Z. Now in actual, like in generational theory, Gen X isn't called Gen X. They're called the 13th generation. And in generational theory, Gen Z isn't called Gen Z. They're called Homelanders. And the reason why they called them the Homelander generation is because they started being born right after 9/11, where Homeland Security was a dominant influence on the scene. It changed basically the cultural landscape of the United States, or of North America effectively. And so there's a generation that started to be born, I think 2005-ish is when generational theory starts. Homelanders, or what we call Gen Zs, 2004, 2005, which is a bit later than others, by the way. Millennial generations are very, very short and small according to a lot of other generation demographic information. They put them in like 82, 83 to the late 90s, which is like 15 years, which is very, very short. They're a 20-year span for generational theory. Millennials are. And so they go from like 82-ish to like 2003, I'd say. Something around 2003, 2004. So millennials are very like kind of a long generation. And so according to generational theory, Gen Z, or what they would call Homelanders, they're like 18 now, right? They're still in their coming of age. They're still children, effectively. And they'll start moving into young adulthood, or into adulthood soon, young adulthood. But they are the ones who are born during a secular crisis. And so artist generation children, because they're born during a secular crisis, like the nomads, they end up being ignored. Now, nomads were ignored for navel gazing, but artists are ignored because there is legit crisis happening. And so this generation ends up being not just a generation that is kind of ignored, they're a generation that is also expected to be very compliant, right? This is a time period of war. You need to listen to me. You need to obey. You need to get in line. We all need to band together.
Yeah.
So they also have a bit of a collectivist, like, let's all band together feel. And they also tend to be compliant. They tend to be obedient children. Now, if somebody is of this generation right now, especially if they're a teenager, they're not going to be like, I'm a compliant, obedient child. They might not identify with that. But there's a sense of, what does the world need right now? What does it need of me? And I'll show up doing that because I know that we're in a crisis time period. I know that life is hard. I know that it's really tough on everybody. So what do I have to do, and what do we all have to do in order to make life a little easier?
Yeah.
Now, they're called artists, though, because they end up being mostly shielded themselves from the hard work that the heroes have to do. Like, heroes have to go to war, right? The millennials have to, quote unquote, go to war in whatever that means. And we might actually see a literal physical war breakout.
Well, we are seeing that in Europe.
That's right. Exactly. That is currently happening in parts of the world. And we'll see if like somebody, flicks that domino in order to spark something like World War III. Fingers crossed that does not happen. But the hero generation is the one that has to go like physically fight it in some way, or mimetically fight it. The artists don't have to fight it. They just have to be compliant while they watch older people deal with all of it. So artists are born during a secular crisis in winter. And then they enter young adulthood in spring in a high. And then they enter their midlife in summer during a spiritual awakening. So they end up being very influential during a spiritual awakening. And then they end up in elderhood during autumn. So they actually, in the timeline, even though they're born during rough times, they end up not really having to fight much, right? They kind of miss all the action. but they end up becoming so influenced by these time periods that they start creating art out of it. So the phrase is, they sing the songs of the heroes past. They sing the songs and they tell the stories of the heroes that came before. And you can kind of see this energy represented in this generation in Gen Z with all the technology that they make good use of. Like, this is a generation that is on TikTok that's constantly and perpetually iterating in artistic pursuits, in performance, in music, in all these different technological tools that have been given to them to be able to iterate very quickly in artistic pursuits.
Yeah, and it's a very sharing of those ideas.